Hi, friends. I'm Sandra Peoples, one of the co hosts for Key Ministry, the podcast. This is episode 116. And during our time together today, I'm excited to interview Jason Epps and Paul Pettit, authors of the book One Body, One Spirit, Disability and Community in the Church. Jason and Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. And let's start out by both of you introducing yourselves, telling us a little bit about you. So, Jason, do you want to go first?
Sure. So, I originally am from Florida. So, uh, moved to Chicago to do my undergrad at Moody. Then I went to Texas. Now I'm at Midwestern getting my PhD. I'm currently in the writing phase, so it's a lot of hurry up and wait. Uh, but I'm enjoying it. I also teach part-time as an adjunct at Midwestern uh, Baptist Theological Seminary, and it's a fantastic school, and I'm really enjoying it. And I just love that God gave us the uh, opportunity to uh, work together and do this book. I've lived with cerebral palsy all my life, and as your listeners might be able to tell, I'm more on the high functioning side of disability, which has kind of left me feeling like almost a third culture kid,
Yeah.
not really fitting in with the culture with disabilities because I'm too high functioning, not really for the longest time fitting in with my peers because I couldn't really do the high impact sports and things that they would do. I mean, the dorm that I was in at Moody was known as the sports dorm. If that doesn't jive well, which interestingly enough, Paul and I were in opposite dorms. Obviously, we weren't there at the same time, but it's like I was in Dreyer, he was in Colby, so there's a fun rivalry between the two. But
That is
I'm
fun.
glad we didn't let that stop us. So
No, no, me either.
Dr. Paul Pettit. I am from Kansas, and I came to Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas in 1992 and just stayed on. I've been here ever since. So I worked on the THM degree and then the Doctor of Ministry degree. And now I serve here in career services where we help graduates figure out what they're going to do when they graduate. And then they let me teach a couple classes as well. So thanks for having us on, Sandra.
Yeah. And you guys met because Paul, taught one of Jason's classes. Is that right?
yep,
Exactly.
first
Well,
semester preaching one.
yeah, homiletics. Everybody was ready to go, and we heard this knock on the door. We had these huge wooden doors, heavy doors here at Dallas Seminary, and we opened the door, and there was Jason in his power chair, and we were like, "Wow, sorry about that."
Yeah.
And then you go into the classroom, and there's a stage up there, and we're all thinking, "Oh, how's Jason going to get up on the stage?" And we hand up the podium, the pulpit, and it's like way over his head, and
Yeah.
I just began to look at the seminary through Jason's eyes, and that's really impacted me as I was writing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's clear
Paul,
in the book what you guys both learned from that experience.
Paul actually missed the most important part of the story, which was first day he said, "Hey, I've written several books. If any of you have an idea, I'll help you." And for years, people have been telling me I should write this information in a book, but nobody would actually like help me take the next step. And I raised my hand and, thinking, oh, I don't know if this is going to be a nicety or if this is actually going to happen. And lo and behold, with much, you know, blood, sweat, tears, crying, banging on the table, banging her heads against the wall, it finally happened. So
Yes.
Well, I'm glad he took you up on that offer, Paul. I bet lots of students think they can write a book, but to actually go through with it that's usually a longer process than most people are prepared for. So,
That's right. I usually say, bring me the first chapter, and 90% of the students never come back. So
yeah.
when Jason said, hey, I have a 5-step plan, I've already written the rough draft, I knew this guy's serious. We're going to go forward with this project with the Lord's help.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool. And Kriegel is your publisher?
yep,
Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Yeah, I think they do a great job. They bring a lot of really helpful books that add to the conversations that we're having. So I hope they were good to work with because they seem like they would be. So
Absolutely.
that's awesome. Okay, well, I read the book last week.
All
I
right.
read it pretty quickly. I really enjoyed it. And so I have picked out 4 or 5 questions to talk through with you guys. Hopefully it kind of gives a good overview. I tried to pick what I thought were really the strengths of the book, and there's lots of them, but just my favorite parts. But I wanted to just hear more from you about, and so we will jump into those. The first one, in the introduction of the book, you say that your goal is to encourage readers to fully integrate people with disabilities into faith communities. You point out that with Jason's experience as a person with a physical disability, the book has a more narrow focus, primarily on those with physical disabilities. There are both functional or physical barriers and social barriers that exist in our churches. You guys kind of touched on that just as Jason was trying to get into the classroom. So explain to our listeners the difference between functional and social barriers that would exist in churches today.
So I think physical barriers are the easiest to explain because they're the ones that people often think of.
Yeah.
It's like, is there stairs? Is there a need for an elevator? Is there a ramp? Is there 15 million steps to get up to the choir loft? Or is the stage accessible? Or are the classrooms physically accessible? Are they upstairs? Do they have wide enough doorways? Are the bathrooms accessible? Things of that nature. Social barriers are a little bit harder to pin down. It's more of a feeling. It's like, is everybody, I I like to term it clotting. So is everybody physically in a group face into each other where the person with a disability can't physically get to them? Is everybody crowded in an area where they physically can't get to? Or are they almost practically ignored, like they're invisible? They could physically be where the conversation is, but they're practically ignored and there's no way to get into the conversation.
Hmm.
Or like they're unable to do the activities that everybody else is doing. So there's kind of like it's more of it's honestly harder to pin down. It's
Yeah.
like it when you see it, but it's like to actually like describe it, and it varies from, as we point out in the book, disability affects everybody differently. So it's like what is considered one for one person is not really that for another person. So it's a lot more fluid, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also just building a culture of hospitality and welcoming and being open. Hey, we're glad you're here. We look forward to serving you. I know I learned from Jason that he would visit churches sometimes and they would say, "Oh, you're disabled. You're Tuesday nights at 7 p.m." And he would say, "Well, I want to teach a class or I want to write curriculum." And they
Yeah.
would say, "Oh, you're Tuesday nights at 7 p.m."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the question that he asked me that really set this book in motion for me was, "Paul, do you think a church would hire me as their senior pastor?"
Wow.
And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, your sermons were good. You're a thinker, you know the Bible, you know theology. But something inside of me was like, I don't know. I didn't want to lie to him. I didn't want to sugarcoat it and
Yeah.
say, oh, don't worry. Lots of churches will want to hire you as their senior pastor. And so I just bumped up against that social barrier that you talked about.
Yeah. Yeah. So many churches think disability ministry is a place or a classroom, or like you said, Tuesday nights, instead of an attitude of acceptance and hospitality. I think that's a great word to use to
Yeah,
use. And then go ahead,
it's more
Jason. Sorry.
it's more of a mindset.
Yeah. A mindset. Yeah.
Really. And so many books in the disability world are just focused on how to build a program.
Yeah.
And it kind of shelters it, like not shelters, silos it, like
Silos.
like
Yeah.
like you were talking about, like it's only in this compartment, or worse, a lot of well-meaning disability books that we found are mainly focused on the the caregivers who are important. I wouldn't have made it half as far as I did if it wasn't for, my parents behind me. But it's weird when you've got books on disability ministry and almost none of them are actually like dealing with the individual person with a disability.
Yeah.
It would be like doing a Hispanic, ministry, but none of the books, none of the materials are geared towards Hispanics.
Right.
It's almost unthinkable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. All right. You have chapters in the book that cover passages from the Old Testament and passages from the New Testament that talk about disability. I thought that was a great strength of the book to be able to do that. In your chapter on disability in the Old Testament, you give the example of Naomi and Ruth to, and I'm quoting from the book here, showcase what it looks like for those of their social status and physical abilities to fully seek out security. This was one of my favorite parts of the book because I had not thought of Naomi as a person with maybe a physical disability or at least some kind of limitations that kept her from being able to glean for herself, and how Ruth is almost kind of a caregiver, and then the relationship that they have. So I found your treatment of this passage to just be really compelling and encouraging. So can you talk about what you see in this passage that we can apply to our relationships with people with disabilities?
So I think one of the things that really stood out to me, and this was kind of because of the Hebrew professor that I had at the time at Moody, it's the fact that Naomi, repeatedly tries to push Ruth away, doesn't want to be a burden,
Yeah.
and at least I can't speak for everyone, but the people that we've talked to, like that's a primary concern. I'm dragging everybody down. I'm worthless. I'm not worthy to be helped. It's a wonderful life syndrome that it's kind of like that thought process that it would be better for me not to be born, that kind of thing. That kind of thought process is, at least in my experience, spurred on a lot by the church that say, oh, we want you to be here, we love you being here, but go over there in the corner, don't do anything, you're messing everything up. And part of the purpose of the main core of the book, the 5-step plan, is to help the person with a disability, the asset, overcome those hesitancies and feelings of lack of value. So that's one of its main purposes, is to help the person with a disability feel like they're actually valued, that they're actually loved. Because for the longest time, I was told that by so many Christian groups, but they didn't act that out. So it was the hardest thing for me to actually come to and functionally realize.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, what does that practically look like? It's a difference between almost a head and heart knowledge situation. So
Yeah.
that honestly was something with Naomi that I really connected to. And Paul might want to go into this a bit, but it kind of touches on the phrase that he likes of temporary able-bodied. So Paul, do you want to talk about that? Because
We found this phrase temporarily able-bodied, which describes everyone, each one of us, that we're all temporarily able-bodied. I could get in a car wreck this afternoon and be fully disabled. I could go to a military skirmish and step on a landmine and become disabled. So, and even when I'm 80 years old, Lord willing, 90 years old, I'll definitely be partially disabled, maybe trouble with walking, hearing, seeing. So sometimes we put this binary category together. Oh, I'm able-bodied, I'm fine. It's these poor disabled people that I'm here to help. But we're all temporarily able-bodied by God's grace. And, just for a second to talk about Naomi was really in a queen's position. She had a husband, she had 2 sons. In a patriarchal culture, she was set for life. Her husband could take care of her, her 2 sons could take care of her, and then they were taken, they were lost, and she was alone. And she said to her girlfriends, "Don't call me sweetie anymore." The word Naomi means sweetness. She said, "Don't call me sweetie, call me bitter." I mean, her mindset was, I have nothing now. I have no future. I'm just, as Jason mentioned, I'm a burden. Uh, I don't have anyone to help me glean. So yeah, and then the other thing about Ruth is she's considered other. You know, she's from another country. She wasn't an Israelite. She didn't yet worship Yahweh. And a lot of our research, we found that persons with a disability feel othered. They
Mhm.
feel like I'm not normal, or I'm not part of this normal crowd. I'm other than. And
Yeah.
so that was a big part of our research.
Yeah. That's interesting because then we can relate both to Naomi and to Ruth in different ways in this
Right.
story. And that's really good. I have a husband and two sons, and so I think of that. If I lost them, I would feel like I lost everything. And so
Yeah.
I could see what a spiral that would be for Naomi and what a burden she would feel like. So,
Blessing of the turnaround in the book is that she meets Boaz, this kinsman redeemer, and God provides for her. Even in her deepest, darkest time of need, God meets her in amazing ways and provides for her. And she ends up becoming in the line of our Savior, Jesus, the Christ.
yeah.
So when we think about Ruth and Naomi, we need to remember that God meets us even in our difficulties.
Yeah, yeah. As both a person in need, which we all are, and in caregiving roles, and both of those roles, I think, are so well represented. And the temporariness of being the one who can meet needs and understanding the temporary, able-bodied uh, life that we live and how that could change really quickly. So
Absolutely.
that was really good. Okay, in the chapter on the New Testament, Jason writes, I want to experience the sense that there are no barriers to community. Even in the best possible situation here on earth, there is always going to be some sort of barrier. I feel that too. I have some social anxiety. So even at church events and different things, I feel those barriers that you're talking about. So I know we can all relate to that on some level. So even though the temptation would be for this to kind of discourage those of us in advocacy roles, like if we can only see barriers, then why are we doing so much work, to overcome these barriers? But how are you encouraged by this instead, or the movement that you see in churches, or like how do you hold on to optimism in the face of these barriers that we can sometimes feel overwhelmed by?
Well, I think it's several things. It's acknowledging um that nothing is ever going to be perfect this side of heaven, this side of eternity. Things are always going to There's always going to be barriers, there's always going to be problems. And I would just say, like, don't I know it's a cliche, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You know,
Mm,
I've told this to Paul multiple times, and um friendship, which is the main desire of this book, can really overcome any barrier.
yeah.
So it's like the focus needs to shift from churches of we need a plan for every contingency to we need to generate genuine friendship. I mentioned this in the book, but there were several times when I was in the men's choir back in Moody when the stage would be completely accessible. There was this one church with like, oh, I didn't count it, but like 5 flights of stairs to get
Mm,
up to the main um choir loft, and there was no way that was going to be made ADA because they didn't have the money to do it. I don't begrudge them, but because I had a relationship and because the guys were willing to help, they were able to finagle me up there through basically Ark of the Covenant, the up the several flights of stairs. So it's just I find that churches are like almost unhealthily obsessed with making a building and such physically accessible, and they kind of like almost instantly write it off because they're like, we can't make this accessible, it's too expensive, and therefore we tried, so there's there's no reason to make it accessible. And I'm like, friendship is free,
yeah.
doesn't cost anything but your time. So that's the real important thought here. And going back to the distinction between physical and social barriers. It's like a place can be completely physically accessible, but if you're not really connecting with the community, it can feel worse because you can think to yourself, I should feel like I'm physically present. I'm here physically present, but I'm still, it's almost like I'm not, which at least if it's a physical barrier, you can say to yourself, well, it's a physical barrier, you know. But social barriers are almost, at least for me, it feels worse. So that's why friendship and genuine friendship, which is what we advocate for in the book, is almost paramount and key.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was the answer to the question that you were looking for, but
Yeah. No, that's great. That's a great answer.
For research, Sandra, we found out that 1 in 5 struggle with a disability. So there's so many families that probably visit a church or inquire about a church or parish, and they're asking, would I fit in here? You know, is there anybody on stage that looks like me? Would I be able to build friendships here? So I think this impact that we can have in the church, because the title of the book, One Body, One Spirit, that's what we're going for with God's church. It's Jesus's church. His heartbeat is for those of us that are hurting. Jesus
yeah.
went out of his way to heal and to show people the power of the kingdom. So we are advocating for friendships, because an authentic, genuine friendship. I was talking to Jason about a fear I have sometimes. Hey, I want to help you get into the van, but I don't know where to grab you. I don't want to hurt you or,
Yeah.
and he said to me, well, you might just stop and say, hey, Jason, how do you best like to be helped into the van?
Yeah.
And it was so obvious. And my fear was so unfounded. I was like, oh yeah, that would be a good question.
Yeah.
Hey, do you want me to help you to get into the van? Or, you know, one time we were down here on the corner lawn and the sprinklers went off. And for
Oh,
me, I just jumped out of the way and I was like, whoa, sprinklers. And he was just getting soaked.
yeah.
And I'm going, wow, does this happen often? And he's like, oh, occasionally. You know, I began to look at the whole campus through his eyes
Yeah.
because we were building a friendship. And then later I'd be in an elevator or I'd be in a lunch line and not with Jason, but thinking, if Jason was with me right now, would we be able to get through this lunch line? If we were at this Texas Rangers baseball game, how would I get him up to this third level where I pay for the inexpensive seats?
Yeah.
So the friendship is what helped me see life through his eyes more than just we love, you know, Tuesday nights at 7. I'm not trying to disparage that, but
Right.
a
Right.
friendship, an authentic, organic, growing friendship, which we write about in our book, can be even more powerful.
Yeah. Which takes vulnerability from both of you, right? Like Paul
Yeah.
had to be vulnerable and say, I may ask this question in the wrong way. And Jason had to be vulnerable and say, well, here's what I need. And
Yeah.
so, which all best friendships are built on vulnerability, but there's just always, I mean, there's even barriers that keep us back from vulnerability. And
And even more than vulnerability, which you're right, it's time.
Mhm.
And in today's fast-paced world, it's, you know, I kind of feel like the church views people with disability in a cost benefit analysis of,
Yes, yes.
you know, it's too much work. And I've even had, you know, ministry leaders who I will not mention say this to me, and RAs and other people. It's like, it's too much work to make it so that you could be a part of this. It's just not, that the juice isn't worth the proverbial squeeze.
Yeah.
So, which that again drives the person with a disability more into this spiral of depression and feeling of worthlessness. And honestly, I don't know if Paul is eventually going to mention this, so I will. When we did our research, it was amazing that the vast majority of Jesus' ministry was to people with disabilities. If you think about it, the
Yeah.
people who are blind, people who are mute, you know, the and not even just people with disabilities, people that were the dregs of societies, the tax collectors and sinners. He didn't really primarily minister to the upper crust. He ministered to the, you know, downtrodden. And I wouldn't say, I'm not advocating that we don't minister to the upper crust, but it's just something to think about, that it's not always the looks, the person who looks like the most well-to-do is the, you know, best person to pursue. But that's not how we think.
And oftentimes in our churches, we go for efficiency.
Yeah.
Hey, who's going to do the announcements? Well, we couldn't have Jason. He might talk too slow. We got to have somebody that's slick or, like Jason mentioned, beautiful. But I think if we had more of a representation on the stage, those in the audience would go, hey, this looks more like my neighborhood. This looks more like my school.
Yeah.
So sometimes we get into the celebrity pastor syndrome, and that's really dangerous.
Yeah, and Paul's right. The flip side to that is we also don't want it to be a token situation, that a person is just up on the stage, as kind of like a DEI hire of, oh, we got the person with a disability, check.
Yeah.
We've got the Hispanic person, check. I mean, I talk about this in my book, that it's kind of annoying that occasionally I've been given tasks that, they didn't want me to really be doing, just so that I would actually have something to do. I spent a good um 30 minutes to 45 minutes trying to paint a column, and 5 seconds after all my energy was expended, somebody came behind me and basically painted over what I just did, because I couldn't physically do a good job. And I thought, like, what was the purpose of me doing that? So we're very much an advocate of, use people with disabilities, like everyone, in the roles that God have fitted them for. If find what they're actually geared toward, what they're good at. I mean, obviously you wouldn't want me on the cleanup crew, but it's difficult because a lot of churches have a pay your dues mentality, of you have to show yourself to be uh, dedicated and valuable to the church. And a lot of those activities are physical activities, cleaning up and things of that nature that I couldn't physically do. So you're kind of stuck in a holding pattern. And Lord help you if you self-identify what your interests are. The people of the church are like, you can't do that. That's unspiritual. And I'm like, why can't I? I've been with the Lord for years. I should be able to know what my gifting is.
Yeah.
Why is that unspiritual for me to let you know what I'm interested in doing? I I don't understand that.
And for me, building a friendship with Jason, as you said, it took both ways because in my pride, I was like, oh, I'll help Jason, I'll allow Jason to learn from me. But halfway through our extended friendships and studying and researching and writing, I'm like, I'm learning way more from Jason than he's learning from me.
Yeah.
I started realizing, wow, that was a great insight, or how did he see that, or how did he know that? And I'm like, or sometimes I would be struggling with, hey, we got to do this by tomorrow, and he would say, well, it'll work out. In his lifestyle, he realizes I sat here for 2 hours waiting for the bus, which was on the schedule, but the bus never showed up. For me, I would have started walking or got out of there, and he's like, no, in this lifestyle I've learned, take it patient, take it slow. We might miss a deadline. That's going to be okay, Paul.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about the process of writing is this is so internalized to me that I often didn't really see the practical objections that somebody would say, because for me it's a no-brainer. What Paul really brought to the occasion beyond just his expertise was the whole, well, what about this exception? What should we do in those instances? So I found that immensely helpful, and we hope that that comes through in the book, because Paul helped. I joked with him, I'm like, you're helping me make this so that it seems reasonable to the average person, where Paul could say, yeah, I hear what Jason is saying. It sounds crazy, sounds impossible, but it's actually worth it. It can be done. And really, and we talk about this in the book, the church that I'm going now really embodies that in their culture of thinking. Ideally, we want the entire church body or whatever the organization structure to have this mindset and it permeated. So everybody is thinking this. So the burden is not carried by one singular person or by two people, but it's just everybody is working together and mutually benefiting off each other. No one person is getting burned out because sometimes there's only one person is willing to step up, and honestly, eventually they get burned out, and then one, it ruins the relationship between the person with a disability and the person who's able-bodied, and two, the person with the disability is kind of left in the lurch with nothing to do now. So, which unfortunately for me, that happened more times than I care to admit.
Hmm. I know, for example, some of my weird fears were, well, what if you have some kind of medical episode? What am I supposed to do? I'm not a doctor, and Jason was like, well, we could call 911 or I'm sure someone here could help us, but it was just an unfounded fear. I was like, well, what if I give you a ride? Then you're going to want to ride every Monday morning. Like, I don't want to commit to some 2-year ride sharing program with you. If I give you a ride, then I'm going to be your permanent Uber driver.
Yeah.
And he said, well, you might ask the person, hey, I can't do it very often, but do you need a ride next Friday?
Yeah.
He just kept breaking it down into smaller parts and daily chores so that I realized my fears were like selfish and long term. And, if I build a friendship with this guy, am I going to go 100% into the disability world and never come back out? And he'd just laugh, and say, no, I'm just asking, could we hang out? Could we have a cup of coffee? Could I get to know you a little better? And so it really freed me up to be myself and get rid of some of these unnecessary fears.
Yeah.
Yeah, the key there, and Paul kind of hit on it, is just asking questions and being honest, you know, like in any relationship, being honest from the get-go for a person's availability. And again, our hope is that it won't just affect one person, but it'll affect the entire community. So there can kind of be this, when needed, on again, off again situation, but still have that, genuine friendship, because if a person just is like, oh, it's not my week, I'm going to avoid this person and not interact with them, it's like, is that genuine friendship? No. I mean, just in general, like, think of what you would look for in a friend. Like, in fact, what's funny is a friend of mine, when I was originally like crafting this idea and going through, we were talking about, and he was saying, oh, this is so easy, it's just friendship, and basically this is really funny. So he's like, you could just go onto the stage at Mooney and just say, be a friend, and then roll off the stage. And what he thought was just, go off the stage, like, but then I thought, roll off the stage, like go forward and fall down the stage. And they got sidetracked in this long discussion of like, how would the different majors like interact with
Pulling off the stage and falling off the stage is not a good idea, Jason.
no.
We're glad you didn't do that.
Yeah.
No,
Even if you were doing that to recruit volunteers, that's not a good plan.
no, it's not. But it's funny to think about how, there's a bit of a double entendre there.
Yeah, that is funny. All right. So our last question, it really gets to the 5 steps that you present throughout the book. But this model of inclusion, the 5 steps are notice, engage, research, incorporate, and advocate. And so you want to talk a little bit more about each step and how church, I feel like that's been woven through this whole conversation we've had, just like it's woven through the whole book. So maybe if there's a step that you feel like we really haven't hit yet, or a place that a church can start, anything that has to do with those 5 steps. Let me read them again, so our listeners understand what they are, so that way you can pick and choose which one you want to talk about. The first one is notice, then engage, then research, incorporate, and advocate.
So I kind of want to hit on a couple key elements. Notice is extremely important, because if you're not noticing the environment, if you're not noticing that the person is actually there where they physically are, then you can't do anything else. So all these steps are kind of like sequentially built into each other. There's really no way of skipping over one. Research, as Paul kind of hinted at, is kind of both a passive and an active situation. What do I mean? Passive in the sense of you're noticing areas where you would go, whether or not they would be accessible. Active is, I'm thinking that we're wanting to go to the Royals game or the Dallas Cowboys game. Can this be accessible? So the handler, the person without a disability, goes through the path that the asset, the person with the disability, would go down to see if it would be accessible. One element that I don't think anybody's really doing, and that's really important, is incorporate. Now, the incorporate step is interesting because it takes all the information from the previous steps, the building the relationship, learning the person with disabilities likes and dislikes, which you would gain from the engage stage, the information from the research stage, and you're trying to get buy-in from the larger group. And this is really turning on the head of what is normally done, because what is normally done by well-meaning people is they come to the person with a disability and say, we want you to be involved. Do you have any ideas? There's two problems with that, I guess you would say. One is often the person with the disability doesn't have any ideas because they've never really done anything in a large group, because they've been marginalized and excluded all their life. So they have no ideas. And two, even if they do have an ideas, if the group isn't regularly doing it, they feel like if they make a suggestion, they'd be limiting everybody's fun, because they would just be doing it to check off a box. Mm-hmm. So this whole idea of, once the research is done, the handler would go to the larger group and say, would we want to do this? Jason would be able to do this. Do we want to do it? And then once the group hopefully would say yes, they would come to the act and say, we want to do this as a group. We know you can do this because of this, 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 and this. Do you want to do it? Again, putting the ball back into the person with disabilities court. And 9 times out of 10, I would say they would say yes, because one, we don't have a lot of options for things to do. On the flip side, when I tried doing this myself and nobody would show up to the activities that I were trying to do, it kind of further solidifies the person's thought of feelings of, nobody really cares, I'm invisible, I'm worthless, I'm pointless, like all these thoughts. So of all the steps, when it's done well, incorporate overcomes those sort of feelings. And it honestly takes the most work. Notice and engage, and even research, like, can all be done with minimal effort. But I would say incorporate, of all the steps, is kind of like, it's, in a positive sense, the point of no return. It's where the where the rubber meets the road of, is this going to be a genuine friendship? Is the person willing to put in the effort? And advocate is important, and it's kind of a step that's naturally flowing after that, where you're basically standing up for the person with a disability. And it really depends on the person whether or not you're making sure that they're like included in the physical conversation, or you're helping them navigate the red tape. But honestly, I would say when it's done well, incorporate is like the key cornerstone to this entire process. And it's the one thing that I would say that churches aren't really doing well. You know, I mean, one can say that churches are doing the notice and engage step and maybe the research step well because it's part of the natural element of greeting, but in a lot of instances, churches aren't really that's the one area where they need to improve. And to realize that you I've had a lot of churches that I've been a part of where they have had this mindset of we're going to make the big uh trip, the big whatever the church would have accessible. But the fact of the matter is, it's kind of like how Jesus said, if you're faithful in the little things. So if you're not regularly making sure that the person is feeling welcome and included in those little things, then the person is really not wanting to go to the big things. For instance, there was this uh, social outing in the college ministry I was a part of when I was back at Moody, and regularly in the college ministry, I was ignored. I was actually told repeatedly, "You're in the way. Go over here." Honestly, and then the and then the college pastor was like, "Hey, we have this social event coming up. You know, we'll make it accessible. Let's go through all the things that we would need to do to make it accessible for you." Which you would think would be well-meaning, but when I was thinking through, I'm like, okay, what are all the extra things that I would need to do? You know, I would need to make sure that I bring on a personal care attendant and that they would be okay with coming and that or that they would know that I would be back late and then beyond all those I would be like, what's the guarantee that they're not just going to treat me the same that they do every Sunday morning, that they're going to practically ignore me and that I'm going to be off in a corner and then all this effort would be wasted, you know? So it's like, it's not worth the juice isn't worth the proverbial squeeze because they haven't demonstrated, you know, faithfulness in the little things that they actually care enough for, you know, me to go through the extra effort to go to the bigger things. So I would say as a point of encouragement, don't start small because you would need to start small anyway.
Yeah.
You know, if you aim to make the big events like super accessible, and honestly, it's not a prison of two ideas. You can work both simultaneously. You know, don't say, "Oh, we can't work on this because we haven't built the low stuff yet." No, I would never discourage someone from doing that. But if you can do one thing, focus on the little things first. Focus on the natural, organic development of the relationship, and you know, just realize that relationships take time, and what you're often dealing with people with disabilities is overcoming years and years of trauma, which takes time, you know. But ultimately, at the end of it, both of you, as Paul was kind of hinting at, would be healthier and better for it because one, the the person without a disability would realize, you know, them growing because of it, and two, the person with a disability would say, "Hey, I'm actually valued. There's some worth that I bring to this. You know, I'm actually part of the body. There's an area in which I can serve. Let me serve in the area where I could be most impactful." You know, so
Good answer, Jason. It was a long answer, but it was a good answer. My disability is ADHD, so I forgot the question. That's just a joke. That's a disability joke. I have ADHD, so sometimes I have to pay attention a little closer. For me, the favorite one is advocate, number 5, because what I learned from Jason was I could stick out my chest and go, I'm an advocate. I'm an advocate for the disabled. Oh, how do you know that? Because I put a handicap parking spot in here. I'm now an advocate. But what I learned from him was, you don't even know me. You know, you don't even know my likes. You don't even know my interests. How are you presenting yourself as an advocate? You didn't even work through notice, engage, research, incorporate. We haven't spent hours and hours together. So advocate is kind of like when someone says, "Hey, do you think Jason would want to go to the Dallas Cowboys game?" I am such a friend of his now, I would say, "No, probably not. That's the biggest headache ever." But if they said, "Do you think Jason would want to go to the Jason Bourne spy movie?" I would go, "Oh yeah. Oh yeah." He's I mean, in our book, he calls himself the asset and I'm the handler. You know, like, why didn't we turn that around? I wanted to be the asset. You know, he got to name our roles. But I would say, oh yeah, they'll definitely want to go to the Jason. He'd roll his power chair through broken glass to go to the James Bond movie coming out. So advocate is, I know Sandra Peoples so well that this is what she's really going to want to do. Not just, oh, Sandra's an incredible podcaster. Yes, she probably wants to do this.
Yeah.
So that's why, and we like to call it the 5-step challenge. You know, are you willing to build a genuine, authentic friendship with a person with a disability? Are you really willing to take the 5-step challenge and build an authentic friendship with a person with a disability?
Yeah, that's really good. I love that the themes throughout our conversation have been friendship and hospitality, because that's really at the heart of what you guys are proposing and encouraging, which is not a siloed ministry. It's in every program in every church, and churches of every size can do this, right? Like, we don't have to leave it to the big churches or the ones with the biggest staffs or a dedicated person
And
on staff to meet
and
needs.
and sometimes the smaller churches are better at it,
Yeah.
because bigger churches sometimes can be like, oh, we have a program for this. We don't need, you know, genuine friendship, which I just think is a total shame.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, and one, it doesn't really cost anything. So cost isn't a factor.
Yeah.
Because sometimes churches are like, well, we can't afford to do it the right way. And as I've said to Paul, in order to make something accessible, it doesn't have to be done the right way. It just has to be done in a way that works. You know, I've gotten on stages with blocks of wood. You know, now I know, given the current economy and situation, wood is worth its weight in gold, but you know, it's the principle of the thing. So one, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and two, let the person with disability tell you specifically, you know, what they need, and ask, you know, and really mean it. Not the whole, how's your day? Oh, I'm asking you how's your day, but I don't really want to know how your day is.
Yeah.
But
That's all really helpful. So I really appreciate the time that you guys gave this morning to chat through all of this. I think it's a really important book for ministry leaders and pastors to read, and church members who are all a part of this team. I mean, it can change the culture of an entire church and provide bridges to the gospel for people with disabilities, when before they've just there's just been so many barriers, and you guys are really knocking those down and then building bridges so that they have access to the gospel and to a gospel-centered church family, which we all need on our hardest days and our best days. So thank you for casting a vision for that in this book. I think that's been really helpful.
well, it's been a pleasure. So
Yes,
Thanks for
thank
having us.
yeah. So our listeners can find a link to the book in the show notes. The show notes are at keyministry.org/podcast. And so we all the links that we talked about to the book and to anything that we feel like would other conversations we've had that have been on these similar topics, we include those, and then anything else that we feel like would be helpful for the listeners. And so thank you so much for your time, Paul and Jason, and appreciate it, and just encourage our listeners to go out and buy the book and be changed by it, and just look for those ways that they can take the challenge and go through those 5 steps and be advocates for the people that they know and have built real friendships with. So thank you guys.
Sandra.